So welcome to this joint event of tracks, of the Track Center at George Mason University, the Terrorism, Transnational Crime and Corruption Center, GMU's DHS Center of Excellence called the SINA Center, which is Criminal Investigations and Network Analysis, and NSITE, DHS's Center of Excellence for the National Counter-Terrorism Investigation Technology and Education Center at the University of Nebraska at Omaha. And I am Louise Shelley, your host for today. I am a professor in the Schar School at George Mason and the director of the Track Center. We have many people online from all over the United States and literally from internationally. And so the way we will handle questions is that we will have you submit them through the chat box, and I will monitor the chat box, and we also have a channel amongst ourselves to monitor these questions. So we're going to allow plenty of time for interaction and discussion on this important new book in which our authors today had a key role in putting together. The event honors the release of a new book called Beyond 9/11, Homeland Security for the 21st Century, that was recently released by MIT Press. Leading academic experts and former senior government officials address the most salient challenges of today in Homeland Security: counterterrorism, cybersecurity, critical infrastructure, border security, and immigration, transportation security, emergency management, combating transnational crime, and protecting privacy in a world of intrusive government scrutiny, and managing the sprawling Homeland Security bureaucracy. Despite its broad reach and the sober topics that it's discussing, I can assure you that it is a highly readable book that is accessible to a range of practitioners, students, policymakers, and we look forward to you participating in not only this event, but in the reading of the book. So our first speaker, who is going to give us an overview of the book, is Alan Berson, who is one of the editors here. Alan is let's put it this way, a larger than life figure. As I've heard from people who worked with him when he headed the Border Patrol, that despite the fact that he was then a mature professional, he would ride a horse better than many members of the Border Patrol who were several decades his junior. One might not expect this when you look at the pedigree of Mr. Berson. He did his undergraduate degree at Harvard, but we get some idea of his diverse capacity because he was in the Athletic Hall of Fame. Then from 1969 to 71, he was at Balliol College at Oxford as a Rhodes Scholar, and he came back to do his, whoever it is, you need to mute yourself. I don't know if that's me or not. And then he came back to do his law degree at Yale Law School. What is most relevant to his biography for today's discussion is that he led DHS's transnational engagement, served as the principal advisor to the Secretary on International Affairs, and between 2012 and 2015, Alan Berson served as a vice president of Interpol for the Americas and as a member of the Interpol Executive Committee. In 2009, he served as assistant secretary and special representative for border affairs in the Department of Homeland Security. So he has worked with the full range of issues, and at times he's had the informal title of being border czar of the US. So let's turn the floor over to Alan, who'll set the stage with the book. Then I will introduce our two other speakers, and then Alan will come back to talk more about his contribution. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Shelley, for that very kind and mostly accurate introduction. I appreciate, as do my colleagues, Caitlin Durkovich and Seth Stoddard, the opportunity to appear in the George Mason University community to discuss the book that was released by MIT Press, as you indicated, this past August. Let me describe the origins, the genesis of the book. It started really with in a conversation among Juliet Kayyem, who is the director of the Belfer Center at the Harvard Kennedy School, and Chapel Lawson, a professor at MIT, two colleagues, as are Caitlin and Seth, that I had the honor and opportunity to serve with in the Department of Homeland Security. Juliet had been the Assistant Secretary for Intergovernmental Relations, and Chap Lawson headed up the Office of Policy at Customs and Border Protection. And the notion, and this was back in a couple of years ago in 2017, with the end of the Obama administration, we thought that it would be timely and of use to the practitioner as well as the academic and general public to assess where Homeland Security had been. In 2017, we were 16 years away from 9/11, the central event that led to the creation 2 years later of the Department of Homeland Security, and generally a awakening, so to speak, of the American people to the threats facing the United States focused on the homeland. After all, the attack on the World Trade Center and in Washington in 2001 was the first time that we had had an attack against the homeland itself, leading to the death of 3,000 people and a complete reevaluation of our national security and the creation of the discipline of Homeland Security as a branch of national security. So we thought that it would be time to assess the enterprise and call together colleagues from the Department of Homeland Security, the Department of Justice, and other elements of the Homeland Security enterprise, such as Matt Olson from the NCTC, the National Counter-Terrorism Center, and thought that we would look at the range of subjects that Professor Shelley indicated and that are up on your screen, reflected in the table of contents. And there were really three main purposes. One was to assess the current state of the Homeland Security enterprise. The second was to be very candid about the shortcomings and deficits of which we had become aware as a result of our government service and our experience with the Homeland Security enterprise. And the third would be to make recommendations going forward. So it's a book that looks back, but perhaps even more importantly, looks forward to the Homeland Security in the 21st century. And of course, now in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic, we see perhaps as never before just how critical it is to keep capacity flexible and agile enough to respond to a changing set of threats. In 2003, when DHS was formed, the cornerstone mission was, and to some extent still is, counterterrorism. But with the public health challenges, the cybersecurity challenges, the transnational criminal organization challenges that we face, the need for adaptation is clear. And this book was an effort on our part to start that discussion in the broader community. And Professor Shelley, let me conclude where I began, thanking you and the George Mason University and the authorities at the Center of Excellence at George Mason, DHS Science and Technology Center of Excellence, the CENA, for this opportunity to appear. I'm delighted to be here with Caitlin Durkovich and Seth Stoddard, with whom I had, again, the honor to work at DHS. And I'm looking forward to the discussion that flows from their presentations and the audience's questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Caitlin Durkovich. Her expertise is in critical infrastructure, security, and resilience, including cybersecurity, which makes her a uniquely valuable asset to those who work with her as we live in an increasingly interdependent global economy. Over the course of nearly 2 decades of developing physical and cyber risk management approaches, she has worked hard to advance public-private partnerships through leadership and involve industry practices in management and security. Prior to joining Toffler Associates, Caitlin served as Assistant Secretary for Infrastructure Protection with the Department of Homeland Security under President Obama. She led the mission to protect critical infrastructure and redefine public-private risk management for emerging issues like complex mass attacks, electric grid security, cyber security, GPS resilience, and climate adaptation planning, an issue that has been brought to the fore in the last week with all our environmental challenges. She earned a BA in public policy from Duke and a certificate in business strategy from the Aspen Institute. So Caitlin, welcome, and we look forward to your remarks.
Thank you very much, Dr. Shelley, and I too want to express my gratitude to you, to the GMU community, and to the DHS Center of Excellence, CENA, for hosting this panel today. It is really an honor to be here, and it is also an honor to have contributed to the book Beyond 9/11, Homeland Security for the 21st Century. I will tell you that my time at the Department of Homeland Security in leading the mission to protect critical infrastructure was certainly one of, if not the greatest professional honor of my life. To work with thousands or hundreds of dedicated civil servants and members of the Homeland Security enterprise to ensure the security of our infrastructure and therefore so the American way of life could thrive. I also want to thank Alan and Juliet and Chapel for pulling all of us together and really serving as superb editors for this book. It is great, and to your earlier comments, Dr. Shelley, very readable and I think useful for a number of different communities. So happy to be part of this event today. And I am going to talk more about the chapter that I contributed to and wrote on critical infrastructure. And I think that it is worth noting that, you know, a week ago we marked the 19th anniversary of 9/11. It was an attack that was perpetrated by the transnational extremist militant organization Al-Qaeda. The Al-Qaeda terrorists capitalized on our lack of imagination. They weaponized critical infrastructure and, you know, in almost, 2 hours times killed nearly 3,000 Americans. It certainly, marked a new time in this country, a loss of innocence, and created the very institution that Alan and Seth and I and Juliet and Chapel all served at, the Department of Homeland Security, as well as new partnerships to ensure that the type of destruction and disruption that we saw 19 years ago would never happen again. And yet, two decades later, we stand here, and I would say that now more than ever, we are seeing transnational threats that are increasing in both scope and complexity. Certainly, the threat of terrorism has not waned, and we remain very concerned about international terror organizations, to include Al-Qaeda, the Islamic State, the Lebanese, Hezbollah, and others. But even, I think, some ways more frightening and more concerning, we've seen the rise of domestic terrorism, white in far-right supremacist groups here in the country and other domestic extremist networks. And as much as we have been addressing and responding to COVID, we've seen another threat emerge on our other flank when it comes to domestic terrorism, and is something that the department and the interagency is focused on. But our adversaries and our strategic competitors are also increasingly using cyber capabilities, cyber espionage, cyber attack, cyber influence to seek political, economic, and even military advantage over our country. China, Russia, Iran, North Korea are leveraging cyber operations to steal our information, to influence our citizens through misinformation, disinformation, and yes, to disrupt our critical infrastructure. Earlier this summer, FBI Director Chris Wray spoke to the greatest long-term threat to our nation's information and intellectual property and to our economic vitality was the counterintelligence and economic espionage threat from China. We also know from the 2019 ODNI worldwide threat assessment that China has the ability to launch cyber attacks, causing localized disruptive events on critical infrastructure, such as a natural gas pipeline. And then yesterday, the director also came out and talked about how Russia was actively pursuing a disinformation campaign against former Vice President Joe Biden. We also know that Russia has the ability to execute cyber attacks in the United States that will generate similar localized and disruptive effects of that I was alluding to, that China had the capability to do, similar to what they demonstrated in the Ukraine in 2015 and 2016 in terms of disrupting the local electric grid there. They are mapping our critical infrastructure, a result of their doctrine that recognizes the importance of critical infrastructure and the need, if it comes to it, to disrupt our infrastructure in order to escalate to de-escalate. We also know that Iran can cause damage to corporate and industrial networks. There's ongoing reports of Iranian cyber actors that are conducting multi-phase cyber operations against US companies. They're accessing sensitive business operation. They're stealing intellectual property and vendor information. And then we have the unknown, right? The rise of ransomware as a service on the dark web. Any really actor, transnational or domestic, can buy ransomware. There's levels, different tiers of support that you can ask for. You can target highly sensitive information. You can ask for companies to be targeted. And so kind of the rise of ransomware of a service points to the creativity and the imagination that our adversaries are using, and we have to be kind of equally as imaginative in terms of how we respond. This is all exacerbated, frankly, by the increasing interconnected and interdependent nature of our infrastructure, and that when you have a disruption or attack on one sector, it can easily cascade across other sectors. We've seen the impacts of something like that, not this year related to the COVID pandemic, and how quickly the pandemic and the disruption cascaded across our supply chains. The same thing can happen in cyberspace and in the virtual world. So I want to kind of shift from that context and that landscape to talking a little bit about the critical infrastructure chapter and beyond 9/11, Homeland Security for the 21st century. I speak in that chapter to the important partnership that has been the foundation that has really been the focus of critical infrastructure protection for the last 20 years, and it is the voluntary partnership. It is a partnership that was born out, frankly, of some very prescient policy in 1998, PDD 63, which recognized that our future enemies, whether nations, groups, or individuals, were going to seek to harm us in non-traditional ways, and that we had to bring together government and the private sector to address this threat. For the most part, this partnership has been incredibly successful in addressing the threats that we have faced the last 20 years. But that's also in part because our operations were more analog. The threat vectors were less sophisticated, and that our sectors were contained and bounded. We hadn't really created this complex ecosystem of infrastructure that's highly dependent and interconnected. Because we have transitioned to a digital environment where we are highly reliant on the internet, we are highly connected and interdependent. It is certainly worth revisiting how we, I shouldn't say revisiting, but visiting or rethinking how we imagine this partnership. It has come time to think about how we modernize it and we adapt it to meet the challenges that we face today. We know that we have sophisticated campaigns that pose systemic risk and even existential risk to our country, and we need to rethink how we work with, and when I say we, I mean the government, but how the government works with the private sector, given that the vast majority of our critical infrastructure is owned and operated by industry, and really industry is on the front lines of defense. Information sharing was long the cornerstone of what government offered to industry in terms of working to mitigate these threats. But we've moved into a threat environment where information sharing solely is not sufficient. And that's in part because of what's going on in the networks of the owner-operator community. And while the government possesses authorities and capabilities that give it unique intelligence and the ability to disrupt our adversaries, we need to better understand what's going on the networks of our adversaries. And so in closing, it really is time, as my friend and mentor, Tom Fanning, who's the CEO of Southern Company, says, to think completely differently about how we deal with this threat. Certainly since we put pens down on this book, the thinking around this has evolved. We've had the Cybersecurity Solarium Commission offer its recommendations, and I think that we have a roadmap and a path for how we can move forward and adapt and modernize the public-private partnership. One of those recommendations is actually creating a designation called systemically important critical infrastructure, which would designate the most critical of critical infrastructures and both put expectations and accountability on those private sector owners and operators to secure and enhance the resilience of their networks. But it would also mean that government would have additional responsibility in providing capability to them. That same commission report talks about creating a joint collaborative environment where we can have a better understanding, government and industry, of what's happening on networks. I think it's a laudable idea. I think that in implementation it gets a lot harder, but it is certainly something that is worth exploring. We have the ability to kind of influence what's happening on private sector networks through government acquisition. We're seeing the Defense Department do a lot around DFARS, which is their federal acquisition regulation, and also the new cybersecurity maturity model. One of the things that I've advocated for in another piece of work that I've done with the Atlantic Council on the future of DHS is the need for the intelligence community to take the private sector seriously as a key customer and to understand their requirements and to begin to collect on threats against the critical infrastructure. And then, finally, as much as I am a believer and a supporter of the voluntary public-private partnership, I think we do have to have a conversation in this country about whether we need more regulation around cybersecurity to compel and to make sure that we're raising the bar. I want to end on one note. In recent weeks, because of events that have transpired, there has been a call to abolish the Department of Homeland Security. I do not think in any form or fashion the department should be abolished. It serves a very important mission. It has a long legacy of helping secure this country, of enabling the American way of life. It is vital, given the threat landscape that I have laid out. It serves an important role in coordinating the Homeland Security enterprise and bringing partners and stakeholders to bear to address these threats. And as Alan alluded to at the beginning of his remarks, is important in terms of driving the capacity and ensuring the capacity for us to be flexible and agile as these threats emerge. So I want to continue to thank my former colleagues at the Department of Homeland Security for their important and vital service, and I will do all that I can to support you. So with that, Dr. Shelley, thank you very much. I'll turn it back over to you.
Thank you, Caitlin. And it's wonderful the audience is keeping its time, because I am sure we're going to have many questions from the audience. You're certainly going to have them from me. Our next speaker is Steph Stoddard, who is joining us from LA, Los Angeles, where he is in the office of Holland and Knight, advising clients on a wide variety of legal and policy issues related to national and homeland security, COVID-19 pandemic, and international trade. His special expertise for this book comes from his years in the Obama administration as Assistant Secretary of Homeland Security for Borders, Immigration, and Trade, as well as Assistant Secretary of Homeland Security for Threat Prevention and Security Policy. In these roles, he served on the DHS leadership team and led policy development and DHS diplomatic engagement on various issues, including border security, immigration, asylum and refugee policy, international trade and foreign investment, transportation security, law enforcement, counterterrorism, and many other issues, which shows you how large the DHS mandate is. He has a BA in history from Haverford and a JD from the University of Southern California Law School. And I'll say he's also an extremely agreeable participant in this. We had a practice call at 8 Washington time, which meant 5 in LA, and Seth was up there smiling with his cup of coffee. So with that, I turn this floor over to you, and we look forward to hearing your comments. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Shelley. It's really an honor to be part of this panel. Great to be invited. And also thank you to my good friend and mentor, Alan Berson, who helped co-edit the book and pulled me into this project, and also pulled me into the Department of Homeland Security, into the Obama administration. So thank you very much to Alan. And also to Caitlin, great to be on the panel with you, good friend from our time in the government. So I want to talk, I guess my talk is really about law enforcement. It's entitled Law Enforcement Targeting, Finding the Criminal Needle in the Legal Haystack. I mean, when I say targeting, and this isn't like, drone strikes against, this is it's perhaps not the best word that we've used, but it's the word that we've used since the 9/11 attacks in terms of what we mean by really screening and vetting people and things in commerce as they move through the vast systems of the global economy. And I guess the other thing also, just before I sort of start the talk, I guess I'll mention further by way of background on me, I mean, I served in the Obama administration as discussed, but before that, I also served in the Bush administration and served as, I was head of policy for US Customs Service. I came into the administration very shortly after the 9/11 attacks and was head of policy for Customs, and then what became US Customs and Border Protection when DHS was created. And I mentioned that also because I think in light of, I think what Caitlin was talking about in terms of the debate over whether DHS should continue to exist, I guess, I mean, and I wholeheartedly agree with Caitlin in the sense that, we need to continue it. But I mentioned my experience in the Bush administration also. by way of saying that the point of DHS was always to be non-political. And it was always to be, as my old boss, Tom Ridge, used to say, we don't do politics in Homeland Security. And that was the intent. And I think we've, some of the issues that we've seen in DHS is that we've drifted from that basic dictum and moved into a bit more of a politicized world of looking at DHS and its function in the United States. And that perhaps we can discuss that a bit more in the comments, but I highlight that because I think it's an important point. I think also with this book is that the book includes authors who were served on both sides of the aisle. This isn't just essentially the Obama team talking about Homeland Security. These are people who've served in Republican and Democratic administrations since 9/11. So by way of that as an introduction, I guess in terms of talking about this topic and getting into it, it's a huge topic, and I think probably the best way to start it is really with a story, which is, first off, my own personal story. I was a lawyer supposed to argue a case in federal court on the morning of 9/11, and then I was in New York City, and boom, 9/11 happens, and changed the world and changed my own life as well, and cost nearly 3,000 lives and launched us on this 19-year phase of essentially perpetual war around the world in some ways, changed the world in many different ways, changed the United States, changed the world. But I mention that also because we all remember 9/11, obviously, but what we don't remember is 9/12 and 9/13, which is the days after 9/11, which especially at the borders of the United States with Canada and Mexico. And in those periods, so it would make sense after the biggest terrorist attack in the history of the United States that all parts of our society would seize up and decide that we had to go to maximum security. And the borders were no different. Immediately after the attacks, the border agencies, which at the time were the U.S. Customs Service and the Immigration Naturalization Service, went to what was called level 1 alert at the borders, which meant really questioning every traveler coming across, inspecting all or most cargo shipments coming across, which makes sense intuitively, except for the fact that the inevitable result of that kind of maximum security was essentially an attempted suicide of the North American economy. Because what happened was that you had wait times at the US, Canada, and US, Mexico borders that were 12 to 14 hours at the time. And if you think about that, not only is that taxing on the bladders of various truck drivers, but it's also taxing to the economy, because as the global economy has evolved, or it evolved in the 20th century, we had made our economy fundamentally transnational and borderless, where the economy was dependent upon what was called the just-in-time inventory system, which was essentially the businesses could see that they could reduce costs by eliminating as many large warehouses as possible and having essentially all the intermodal containers that move through the global economy be mobile warehouses that get parts to where they're supposed to go at the time where they need them. So when you have a disruption like 14-hour wait times at the northern border, what that meant was that automotive assembly plants in Michigan were starting to shut down because they couldn't get their parts from Canada. And similar things were happening on the Mexican border. And then in addition to that, of course, we shut down aviation for a while, and also we tightened the visa rules. So we made it very difficult for people to come to the United States as well. So what we did in response to the terrorist attack is that we threatened economic suicide. And luckily, I think we all very quickly recognized this and had to figure out a way to get out of this. And really what I think of this is that what happened in the days after 9/11 was that the old way of doing business at the borders, where we viewed the border as sort of the last line of defense and we had to keep things out at the border line, was suddenly exposed to be at complete variance and complete conflict with the reality of the global economy and with the reality of the way the world works. And the way the world works now is, and here I'll credit my mentor, Alan Berson on this, is that the world works as a system of flows. And borders, physical borders and jurisdictional borders are lines, but the global, what? Hello? What was that? But the world economy moves to the system of essentially 5 flows or 4 flows: the flows of people, commerce, data, and money movements. And so if you interfere with those flows, the economy starts to shut down. So we need to figure out a way to secure our borders and secure those flows, but without stopping them fundamentally. And there was real risk. I mean, in the sense of the year before 9/11 at the northern border, we caught a real, honest to God terrorist, Ahmad Rassam, the Millennium Bomber, who was trying to come into the country from Canada to attack Los Angeles, my hometown. So we had to figure out a way to achieving both goals of not only securing the country against terrorism and criminal violations and all that, but also to facilitate the flows of commerce and travel. So how do we do that? The first thing I think to think about is the shift, the paradigm shift. I mean, it's which was sort of acceptance of reality. And the reality is you can't eliminate risk. When you walk out your front door, you put yourself at risk. You stay inside your house, you put yourself at risk. Here in California with earthquakes or with, murderous cats, who knows? But the secret here is to manage risk. And part of managing risk is assessing. You have to both assess the risk and then take steps to manage that risk. And a key piece of assessing risk is reducing the unknowns in the system. And I hesitate to quote Donald Rumsfeld, but this is a great place to do it. In his sort of format and thinking about the world in terms of four things. There are known knowns, there are unknown knowns, and the 9/11 story being a classic example of unknown knowns in the system, where you had bits of data and information that were known by the United States government, but not effectively shared. So the CIA knew about two of the hijackers, didn't share that information with the FBI, and that undermined our ability to stop the attack. So there were unknown knowns in the system. Then there are also known unknowns. Look, we know that there are certain things that we don't know anything about, and we have to take steps to mitigate those risks. And then there are the unknown unknowns, sort of the black swans out there that we can't predict and know anything about. And so the secret to finding the needles in the haystack, as we determined, without crushing global trade or global travel, was how do we increase the numbers of knowns in the system so we can assess the risks of those knowns. And if we can identify them as low risk, push them to the side, let them come across borders, let them get on airplanes quickly. So then we can focus our finite resources of law enforcement, border screening, airline screening, whatever else, on two things. One is the known high risks. So if you can identify the known high risks, maybe you'd put them on a watch list or something like that, and you'd focus your resources on them. And then you also could focus your resources on the genuine unknowns, the people or things or money movements or data movements that you know nothing about. And so you focus your resources on that. So essentially, I mean, just to summarize, I mean, the secret, the key here was to reduce the numbers of unknowns in the system and identify the knowns. But the other key secret here, the two things here, is that we needed to do this. We couldn't do it on the fly, because arguably after 9/11, when we were questioning every driver and searching every container, we were doing that too, but we did it in a way that caused enormous backups at the border, 14-hour wait times. And we've seen this again now. I mean, the old thinking has come back in some ways. We saw this in San Ysidro, the port of entry between Tijuana and San Diego a few weeks ago, when Customs and Border Protection decided to enforce the ban on non-essential travel into the United States by reducing the number of lanes, questioning people before they came in for their purpose for coming into the United States. And what happened? You had 10-hour traffic jams in Tijuana and huge border backups. So you can't do this at the border. The other thing is you have to, if you're going to collect information and analyze it, you also have to do it consistent with constitutional rights, privacy rights, and also due process, in the sense that if people get on watch lists, you need to give people an effective way of getting off watch lists through redress mechanisms if they shouldn't be on the watch list. So this was an approach that was coined at the time in agreements between the United States and Canada and the United States and Mexico, called smart borders. And really there are four elements to smart borders. One is the collection of information and then the synthesis and analysis of that information. And then the information I would say that I would focus on is one is the collection of information from the private sector actors themselves through the flows of, say, advanced passenger information and passenger name record information on airline travelers, for instance, or the collection of trade data. through the 10+2 and 24-hour rule, information from shippers, or ACAS, the air cargo advanced screening information from air carriers and express shipments, to collect that information. Also, you're collecting information from within the government. So again, reducing the numbers of unknown knowns in the system by sharing information between, say, the Department of Homeland Security and the Federal Bureau of Investigation, or with the intelligence community, or across the different parts of the government that collect trade data through what we call the single window of collection of information into the country. Then we also are sharing information with our foreign government partners as well as with the private sector. And then there's also other relevant information that we might, depending on legal restrictions or privacy restraints, maybe tap into analyzing social media information and all that. Then we're analyzing this information, and we're getting better all the time. We created after 9/11 something called the National Targeting Center at Customs and Border Protection. We also created things like the National Counter-Terrorism Center and other information fusion centers that sort of allow the government, either within itself or also sometimes in concert with other foreign governments or the private sector, to synthesize and analyze that information. And we're getting better and better at that all the time with more sophisticated algorithms, more sophisticated and faster computer networks and systems using the cloud, and also with the advent and the development of such things as machine learning and blockchain technologies and things like that, to allow us to collect and synthesize information much faster, so we can identify the knowns. We can identify the knowns and then assess the risks of those knowns by running them against watch lists, or such as the terror databases or the FBI's National Crime Information Center databases, immigration watch lists. And then beyond that, we also analyze that information beyond the watch lists by sophisticated algorithms and machine learning that would identify linkages within different sets of data, and that's where you spot the unknown knowns. And also through analyzing and finding patterns in the data. And sometimes the patterns are as simple as finding anomalies in regular transmit. If somebody's doing the same thing every single day when they cross borders, but then something changes, that's an anomaly that law enforcement's going to want to take a look at. Or an unusual shipment. I mean, another mutual friend of ours, Rob Bonner, always talks about the idea of, well, what if there's a shipment of bananas from Iceland? Well, that's going to be an anomaly. We're going to check that. So that's another way of sort of identifying and moving through the system. The second element to this is the use of technology, whether it be scanning equipment or radiation detection, or now, I think the key thing when you think about COVID is, well, we need screening tests to actually gain that kind of information on people before they travel. We need effective, cheap, relatively accurate screening tests to reduce and manage the risk of people coming across. Third element was partnership with the private sector and with individuals. And this was something we did immediately after 9/11 at the borders by working with key importing companies like Walmart or Target or others to work to secure their own supply chains. It's much like Caton was talking about in terms of critical infrastructure. Think about supply chains or the airlines or transportation systems as a piece of critical infrastructure that's mostly owned by the private sector. So we have to work in partnership with the private sector to secure those lanes of travel, the movements of supply chains. And that was done through such things as trusted traveler programs like Global Entry or Sentry on the Mexican-US border, or Nexus, or TSA's PreCheck program, or similar international programs around the world. Then also trusted shipper programs like the Customs Trade Partnership Against Terrorism, or Known Shipper for air cargo, and other things. And these are somewhat about convenience. And I think from the perspective of travelers, I mean, I can't do without PreCheck or Global Entry when I travel. Not to say that we travel very much these days anymore, and they are about that. But what they really are about is security, because what they're doing is they're allowing government to collect information from people voluntarily give this information well in advance of travel or shipment, and allow the government to vet that information and identify and assess it to determine whether what kind of risk do they present. And ideally, they're going to present low risk, and so then they'll get into these trusted shipper or traveler programs, and we can reduce the size of the haystack and allow government to focus on the higher risks and the unknowns. And that's essentially the method to the madness here is that. And so when things like the Department of Homeland Security cut off the state of New York from Global Entry, it was ultimately deemed to be a political retaliation against the state of New York. by the federal government. But it was CBP cutting off its nose to spite its face. Because on the one hand, you could say, well, we're just going to make it difficult for New Yorkers. But the reality was it actually made it more difficult for CBP because it reduced the amount of information that it was able to collect on people before people travel. And so it made it much more difficult for CBP to assess risk on those travelers. And then the last element here is the partnership, the absolute vital necessity of partnership with foreign governments. And I say this, I start with, certainly bilaterally, and we'd start, most importantly after 9/11 was our partnerships with Mexico and Canada within North America. So we worked to secure the perimeter of North America against external threats, whether it be terrorism, whatever else. But that was only one piece of it. There were three pieces of the North America strategy. One was working together on the perimeter strategy and working, have Mexico and the United States working together to analyze the risks presented by, say, air travelers flying into Mexico City, or working with the Canadians on similar sort of things. But also it was working together on internal threats. So we over the last 20 years, we've developed closer and closer relationships, say, with Mexican law enforcement, intelligence, and military to work on the fight against the cartels or other things, or manage migration flows through North America. And then the third crucial thing was to thin the mutual borders, to reduce the unnecessary barriers to trade between our three countries, so as to really fulfill the promise of NAFTA and now USMCA, and expand cross-border trade and commerce, and build on this hyper-competitive North American market that we have. And so that was that's an example of working with our foreign governments to do both improve security, but then also improve the flow of commerce and travel. But this was also done with other countries around the world, including the Five Eyes countries like the United Kingdom or Australia or other places, also through networks like the Visa Waiver Program. So we collected more information on visa waiver travelers through the ESTA program. And so again, Visa Waiver became like global entry. You think of it as a convenience program, and it is. It helps you travel faster. And again, back in the days when we could travel across the Atlantic. But it really became a security program because it became a deal. The countries participated in the Visa Waiver Program with the United States if they shared information. They committed to share information with us, not only on terrorist threats, but also on criminal threats, transnational crime and other things. And so, we are still building that kind of information and security network that comes out of the Visa Waiver Program. And then the other key thing is that not only did we share information with our partners, but we agreed to do things on request. So if our targeting saw a shipment that was at risk, a risky shipment in Rotterdam, we could ask the Dutch authorities through the Container Security Initiative to inspect that shipment for us. Or we also built and are continuing to expand pre-clearance networks around the world where we screen people before they come into the country. And actually had full pre-clearance, or we do something called the Immigration Advisory Program, where we vet people before they get on planes. So that's really was the approach. And then beyond that, beyond the bilateral efforts, we took it multilaterally through such things as the UN resolution that President Obama pulled together on UN Security Council Resolution 2178, which broadened this smart border strategy to a global strategy against the movement of terrorist foreign fighters and ISIS, or the World Customs Organization broadened this smart border strategies on commerce through the SAFE framework. So this was an extraordinarily successful strategy that reinvented how we really think about international borders and risk assessment. And it was extraordinarily successful in terms of reducing the risk of terrorism within the United States, at least foreign terrorism in the United States, separate apart from the white nationalist terrorism threat. But it also presided over this moment that we wouldn't have predicted, which was after 9/11. Despite the security threats, we actually dramatically increased global trade and global movements of people in a safe way. And a lot of this was because of how we reinvented the borders to assess risks and manage them as we went along, and didn't succumb to the sort of the dumb borders approaches that we saw right after 9/11 that created these horrible backups at the US-Canada border. And I guess I'll leave you with this last piece, is that unfortunately now I think the COVID-19 pandemic has thrown this reinvention of borders again into disarray, and where countries have reflexively gone back to the dumb borders philosophy, where we are, say the European Union is banning all travel to Europe from Americans because of the risks of COVID, or we have banned travel from China if you've been to China within 14 days, and all these different border restrictions. We've seen this on the US-Mexico border. And these restrictions are, again, the same way that we saw after 9/11. They are both over-inclusive because they're including way too many people who don't present any risk, but they're also under-inclusive because of all the exceptions, like the exceptions for trade or essential travel, whatever, to the point where the public health justification of these really is not being met, but it's also strangling travel and trade. So we need a new smart borders approach to COVID now, I think in the next, as we in the era of COVID, that is going to be, again, focused on the need to collect as much information on travelers and shipments as possible. And in the public health context, there's no substitute here for the kind of ubiquitous screening tests that could allow that to happen. So with that, I'll turn it over. And I apologize for our technical difficulties here, but we're back. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Seth.
Thank you.
And now we turn the floor over to Alan Berson, who's at the Belfer Center at the Harvard Kennedy School and at a global fellow at the Wilson Center, apart from many other activities, because he's not someone who sits and lets grass grow under his feet. So we'll turn it over to you, and the audience, please start thinking up questions for our speakers. Welcome, Alan.
Thank you, Professor Shelley. And I think as the presentations of my colleagues, Caitlin and Seth have indicated, one of the virtues of this book and an explicit aim was to take larger themes and larger topics and actually analyze them and then speak about the operational implications of these. So for example, as Caitlin pointed out, we went in the last 5 to 7 years from thinking of infrastructure only in terms of dams and subway systems and railway systems to understanding that cybersecurity and critical infrastructure protection were one and the same thing, that in fact we needed to stop looking at them as mutually exclusive. And so as Seth just brilliantly demonstrated in his analysis of new borders, we had to see the border management not as only a security function, but also as a trade facilitation function to expedite lawful trade and travel. And in doing that, we actually discovered that trade facilitation, expediting lawful trade and travel, and security were not opposite sides of a coin, but rather the same process, understood differently. So I'd like to actually do the same and look at another large trend that affected the way in which we looked at transnational crime and the investigation of it in the Homeland Security context. Remember when DHS was formed in 2003, it was a merger and a bringing together of 26 separate agencies from across the landscape of the American government, including creating new agencies like TSA, but taking customs, which had been in Treasury, and immigration services, which had been in the Department of Justice, and creating Customs and Border Protection and Immigration and Customs Enforcement. So most of the legacy of law enforcement in DHS was from the Department of Justice or the Department of Treasury, and it was completely grounded in the prosecution in the traditional criminal justice model, which is go out, find criminal wrongdoing and arrest, prosecute, try, convict, and imprison the perpetrators of that criminal activity. But what we have discovered in the context of Homeland Security in a global age are two propositions that we needed to take into account in asking, what is law enforcement in the Homeland Security context? Is it different than our traditional understanding of arrest and prosecution? And the two propositions that really led us to, or lead us to rethink this is, first, that Homeland Security is, while it deals with domestic security, it's inherently transnational. The reason Seth indicated, hardly anything affects the homeland that doesn't have a cause or effect generated abroad. Therefore, you cannot look at this as anything other than transnational, needing the international cooperation. But also it presents the problems of being able to affect events happening abroad that have an adverse effect on the United States. So that it sometimes surprises people to be informed that Homeland Security, the agencies of Homeland Security, have the largest footprint abroad than any other agency civilian agency aside from the Department of Justice and the Central Intelligence Agency. And in that context, we begin to see that the old bright lines between Homeland Security and national security, between law enforcement, border security, between national security and law enforcement are actually something that is an anachronism and has to be revisited. And we've actually laid that out, I think, in the book. The area that I'd like to focus on is the chapter that Chap Lawson and I wrote on transnational crime and Homeland Security, in which we basically confront the fact that the problems that we face from the underworld of globalization cannot be successfully tackled or countered with the traditional criminal justice model. And I say that as a former prosecutor, as a United States attorney whose job it was at the Department of Justice was to supervise the arrest, prosecution, hopefully the conviction, and then the imprisonment of criminals. But it became clear to me in our work at Homeland Security that the criminal justice system could not alone accomplish the task of controlling transnational crime, including terrorism. And there were basically three reasons for that. One is extraterritoriality, as Caitlin indicated. Right now, as we speak, GRU operatives from Russia are meddling with our election. They did so in 2016, and they are doing so now. And although they were indicted by Robert Mueller as part of his investigation, the likelihood of getting those operatives, those GRU agents in front of an American court to be able to arrest them is very unlikely. And we should not expect that we're able to do that. So you say, well, what good is it if we can't reach out extraterritorially beyond the reach of our extradition treaties and our relationships with allies to deal with the criminals who are affecting us through the cyber domain? That's the first problem. The second problem is that the scale of these problems is just too large. We cannot arrest and prosecute our way out of the narcotics problem. You cannot take every low-level mule or courier and think that we can arrest them and that's going to solve the narcotics issues that confront the world. Fact of the matter is, we spent many years and untold resources in trying to arrest Chapo Guzman. And we did, we succeeded, and he's now serving a life sentence after having been convicted in New York federal court. But I think it's also fair to conclude that that hasn't in any material way affected the flow of narcotics or the money laundering associated with transnational criminal organizations and the trafficking in drugs. So we needed to confront that we cannot deal with the problems simply by adapting a kingpin or a decapitation strategy, which is let's cut off the head, investigate the criminal organizations, arrest their chieftains, and we will solve the problem. Does not work that way. And the third is that often the criminal justice system, which is intended to deter criminal activity, simply can't accomplish that aim. And the example we cite in Beyond 9/11 is unauthorized migration. We simply cannot, with the hundreds of thousands of people who approach our borders, think that by arresting everyone and prosecuting them, that we can actually begin to deal with the issue. That was the fallacy, and I think we learned it again in the zero tolerance campaign that was launched by Attorney General Sessions, and frankly was completely unsuccessful in stemming the migratory flows. So then what's the alternative? And this is the capacities that we have in Homeland Security, the special authorities that we have at the border to stop people from entering the country, to stop goods from entering the country, to intercept, and to do so without the ultimate aim of trying to arrest and convict someone. The theory of disruption really calls for a new array of tools, the utilization of intelligence to develop strategies that are directed to the organizations of transnational organized crime, including terrorism, and to disrupt their operations, to use the means and methods that are most effective in protecting the American homeland from the effects of transnational crime, but to do so in a much more efficient way. And we've actually begun down that line, but the obstacles are significant. We have bureaucratic legacies. We have metrics that are geared to rewarding our agents based on the number of arrests and convictions they obtain, the culture of law enforcement, which is to nab the bad guy. All of these, together with the divisions of information sharing, keep us from being able to achieve a disruption strategy as effectively as we might. So as Seth pointed out, after 9/11, we did a pretty good job of improving information sharing between the FBI and the CIA, for example, in the context of terrorism. But I think I can represent accurately that information sharing with regard to criminal activities are still is conspicuous by its absence. And that's because the criminal justice system and the model of arrest and prosecution depends on cases. The whole point is to make a case rather than to develop a strategy. And people protect, as they should, their cases, not wanting them interfered with or disrupted before they move on to the conviction. So I think what we need to do is start to affect the changes in organizations and in the metrics that encourage the way in which people conduct their business, to encourage disruption rather than solely the criminal justice model. And I want to be clear, and certainly as a former prosecutor, I'm not saying that we don't use the tools of the criminal justice system. We do, but we use them in connection with other authorities that DHS uniquely has to achieve a better result. And I'm pleased to conclude with one magnificent example of the disruption strategy that actually occurred within the last month, in which agents of Homeland Security investigation, together with the IRS, with the participation of the FBI, actually brought down 3 terror finance organizations using techniques of disruption. We may not end up arresting any of the participants, but Al-Qassam, the arm of the military arm of Hamas, Al-Qaeda, and ISIL were all using online platforms to raise money for their organizations, either impersonating charitable organizations or actually peddling counterfeit PPE online and collecting money. But the one I want to emphasize is where the idea was to raise money from sympathizers and claiming that people could use Bitcoin or other elements of cryptocurrency to actually contribute to the terrorist organization. And in a extraordinary operation that's described in the press release of DOJ on August 13th, 2020, which I urge you to consult, it was demonstrated how using judicial tools other than arrest and prosecution, this group of agents were able to bring down these 3 organizations, and they used undercover techniques, but it was undercover techniques adapted to the digital world, and also using Bitcoin rather than dollars or pounds or francs. And the upshot was that three major terrorist financing techniques were disrupted, with HSI at the end actually controlling the infrastructure and identifying the addresses of sympathizers in ways that permitted further disruption to the protection of the country. So in summary, and I want to close here so we can engage in the dialogue with the audience, we need to use these authorities and techniques. And maybe the last lesson of the book is that the Homeland Security enterprise is still relatively new. It's still unfolding. It's still developing its insights. So I join my colleagues in saying, look, if we abolished the Department of Homeland Security, we'd have to reinvent it. We might call it something different, but there is a real function here. And what we need to do is continue the effort that the book seeks to encourage, which is improve the enterprise, make it more effective so that it can serve the Homeland Security needs of the American people. Thank you, Louise.
Thank you, Alan. And we're beginning to have questions come in. So the question that I had involves both Caitlin and you, as you talked about, Alan, of this amazing investigation that occurred it was announced in mid-August, where we see an overlap between terrorist groups and criminal activity. Are the two of you seeing an overlap between state-affiliated criminals and criminal activity as well? And how much of a threat do you see this as?
So I might take a first crack at that, because there's no question that we've seen it in the past with narco-terrorism. And we are definitely seeing state agents using proxies, using non-state proxies to carry out goals that could not be accomplished without those proxies. So there's no question that in the global environment that we now have, notwithstanding the fact that it was stopped in its tracks by the pandemic, the flows that Seth described are still what characterize the contemporary world. And we are seeing transnational criminal organizations engaged in using terrorist tactics, and we're seeing terrorist organizations engaged in criminal activities, whether it's the FARC selling narcotics in the past, or ISIL expropriating and stealing oil and peddling that on the world black market for energy resources. So the answer, I think, unquestionably is yes, Louise.
I would echo what Alan said, and to the point about, as much activity that we see from the nation state, and I described some of those threats and ongoing campaigns, is that we do know that they use non-state proxies to perpetrate their attacks and their schemes. I talked a little bit about, what we're seeing on the dark web and the availability of in this kind of evolution of ransomware as a service. I think that's another area where you see the intersection of state and non-state, right? And who's propagating that attack method as a service, knowing that there are non-state and other, malicious activities who are willing and have resources to use it. So short answer is yes.
I might also just chime in there a little bit on this, as well as just getting even more philosophical, in the sense of, I think the distinctions between criminal groups, terrorist groups, and states are, at some level, are arbitrary. There have been states. It's not the norm. I mean, we've had states, fundamentally, our state system, in a sense, Westphalia over the last 350 years or so. But the world is becoming ever more borderless, even though the politics is becoming ever more nationalist. But still, things are borderless, and to the point where, and also with technology, sub-state actors like Hezbollah may have as much power as a state, kinetic power, and also the relationships between terror groups, which one person's terror group is another person's freedom fighter, which is another person's proxy from a state. The distinctions are not all that easily made. And then the relationships between terror groups and criminal groups. I mean, terrorism at some level is political violence to achieve a different political objective. Well, when a cartel in Mexico threatens to assassinate the mayor of Juarez, that at some level is a form of terrorism. I guess it's narco-terrorism. So I think the distinctions are difficult to draw, and there certainly is collaboration. I mean, the one thing also I'll highlight is there was a case several years ago, that the DEA uncovered of Hezbollah laundering funds for the Zetas for narcotic sales in Europe and in the Eastern Hemisphere. So certainly there are all kinds of interrelationships here.
Thank you. One of the questions from Peter Santhanam from IBM is, what do you see the role of information technology in making a more surgical approach to Homeland Security, since blunt approaches have serious side effects?
I'm happy to start with that. I think it's a great question. We, increasingly have enormous amounts of data available to us, both because of the databases that we've created and enabling our missions, but certainly through the use of sensors. I think at our time during the department, we were doing a better job of leveraging the combined kind of value of all of these different databases and working with our partners to kind of start analyzing, the risk long before, for example, anybody ever, showed up at an airport and went through screening. That's kind of the last step in the overall transportation security apparatus. There's a lot that's happening beforehand. And so I think that, continuing to architect how we're going to use artificial intelligence, machine learning to be more effective and targeted in how we're disrupting schemes, campaigns, plots is really incumbent, because I agree that the blunt approaches have serious side effects, and in some ways the most serious is the damage to the department's reputation and brand. I'm not at all downplaying some of the other side effects, but if DHS is going to be successful, it needs to maintain the trust that it has with the American people and other stakeholders. And if there's a lot of collateral damage along the way, that trust is diminished.
I might just, Professor Shelley, I might chime in here also and answer the question. I mean, that is fundamentally the question gets to the heart of my presentation in some sense, is that use of information technology and data collection, information connection, and the use of IT to more effectively synthesize and analyze that information so as to assess risk. So we avoid the kinds of things like the 10-hour wait times in Tijuana, and so we can actually more effectively do this. Now, but the other thing I guess I think we will and should get better and better and better as we go through advances in IT. But of course, the flip side is also true to think about here, is as we get better and better through machine learning, artificial intelligence analysis, there is a risk to our freedom from authoritarianism and a greater surveillance state and threats to our privacy. So we need to have strong guardrails around this kind of use of machine learning and IT for Homeland Security purposes, because as we can see, like in Xinjiang or in China, there aren't those kinds of guardrails with the use of this kind of sophisticated IT infrastructure. And so they're having this sort of ubiquitous, persistent surveillance state that is developing in China. And that's something obviously in the United States we want to avoid.
And in the book, we actually take up that challenge that, yes, it doesn't ever make sense in today's world to be a Luddite. Like it or not, we have the technology that we have, and the issue is not to fail to exploit it for legitimate purposes, but to contain and, as Seth stated, it put guardrails around an abuse of that kind of power. But, you know, to my mind, there's no question in response to the questioner's point that big data is the future for Homeland Security. It's not only in terms of risk assessment, but in the context of the transnational crime and disruption. This is the way in which leads should be developed. You know, traditionally in the criminal justice system, good investigators would get a tip. You'd see a crime committed and you'd start working your way up through the chain by making deals on prosecution, guilty pleas that would get you ever higher onto the chain of control and command and control in an organization. Well, you know, we'll still have a place for that, but indeed, big data analysis, the use of machine learning and artificial intelligence can generate much more reliable leads in a much more surgical way than otherwise has been the case. We need to take into account the impact on privacy. Steve Bunnell has a terrific chapter in the book on rethinking privacy in the contemporary context. But again, we should take advantage of it, but also protect traditional values in doing so.
Well, we have great questions coming in. So I don't know how you feel, but you can tell me on WhatsApp if you have 5 more minutes for our audience. The vast majority of DHS resources are devoted to protecting the homeland from illicit activity coming across the borders into the United States. Shouldn't more resources be devoted to targeting activities involving goods leaving the US? Firearms, chemicals, technology. Isn't this critical in light of China's aggressive theft and espionage activities?
I think, Louise, in order to get to the terrific questions that are coming in, I'm happy to defer to Seth on that one. It's right up his presentation, and there are a couple that go right to Caitlin. That way we could maybe able to get to these questions that are coming out of the audience, if you're okay with it.
Yeah, that sounds fine. I mean, I'm happy to take this one. So I agree. I agree with the thrust of the question in 2 ways. One is with regard to exports. Yes, absolutely. Although the items you identify are sort of subject to different sort of threats. I mean, the firearms issue is certainly a domestic threat. I mean, as we think about the growth of the terrorist threat in the US from, say, white nationalist, far-right extremists, I mean, I always think about, you know, risk as a function of threat, vulnerability, and consequence. And threat is a combination of both intention and capability. And we allow people, you know, with the intention to do great violence to have very easy access to AR-15s and AK-47s and other kinds of instruments of mass death. So certainly firearms are a problem domestically. They're also a problem in terms of export to Mexico. I think it's been an irritant in the US-Mexico relationship is the outbound flow of firearms south to Mexico. With regard to technology, certainly that is a massive issue with regard to China in terms of not only sort of the growth and the expansion of jurisdiction of the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, but also issues of cybersecurity and all. And I think certainly that has got to be and is and will be a major focus of the Department of Homeland Security. And what we think about security is as we move further away from the 9/11 foreign terrorist threat, and really kind of the key threats as we think in the United States are really the domestic, you know, terror threat from national extremists, the foreign threat from state actors, whether Russia, China, Iran, or others, and then obviously climate change and things like that. So I think I agree with the thrust of your question. I think it really goes to the core of our book, actually, in some ways, is as we sort of think through, you know, we need to get beyond 9/11. 9/11 has sort of shaped so much of our thinking, and we need to get beyond that because the threats are very different now, as your question highlights.
Hey, Seth, I just want to jump in too, and this is not just, I think we have to think about it beyond the physical departure of goods leaving the United States, but also certainly when you think about intellectual capital, you know, we have to think about it from the cyber sense as well. And it's why the FBI director has, you know, been jumping up and down about the threat, the strategic threat that China poses, and the need to ensure that we are doing all that we can to prevent our intellectual property from leaving through cyber means as well. And so a lot of resources are being devoted to that.
Wholeheartedly agree.
Thank you. Next question. For the creation of new tools and strategies, are these to be created within the sphere of public-private entity cooperation? Where do they come from? How do our panelists see the academics realm in this effort? And let me combine that with another question on what skills do people need to enter Homeland Security, and what should academia be doing to produce them?
Yeah, so let me take a crack at that. There's no question that there's a role for academics to help evolve these new strategies. And in fact, with the research capacity and skills and knowledge that they bring, it's unlikely that we can develop very effective strategies without having those resources brought to bear. But we need to actually make sure that it's done in concert with practice. The usual critique of practices that it doesn't take into account sufficiently the lessons and the points of research coming out of academia. And the standard criticism of academics is that they are not practically oriented. Much as we're going to have to learn, as Caitlin indicated, the idea and a new forms of public-private partnership, we need new partnerships between the world of practice and the world of academia. But indeed, the Homeland Security personnel of the future will need to be grounded in skills, a wide variety of skills. First, there needs to be the development of a discipline of Homeland Security, an academic discipline that will take time to develop, but that people can be grounded in the overall orientation to what is this profession, what does it involve, and then there will be room for specialties, computer scientists, data scientists, as well as investigators with traditional investigative skills, as well as forensic skills in the digital world. We're going to need lawyers who are able to engineer the changes that we need between domestic and foreign authorities and capacities. So the challenge is not to close the door on anything, but to welcome this kind of collaboration and share insights in order to better connect the dots.
Thank you, Alec. Any other comments? We move on to what I think will be the last question. In the aspect of protecting against economic damage from cyber attack, is there an impossible challenge? Is there a modern Maginot Line? Rather than trying to build more monitoring and trying to spot smaller and smaller needles, would money be better spent hardening the target, improving what we do with businesses online, redesigning the internet to remove its fragility, encrypting email, using blockchain? What do you suggest as the way of moving forward to protect ourselves?
Dr. Shelley, I'm happy to take that one. David, I think that's a great question, and I will say that there are a number of different initiatives and efforts, as well as policies that are being promulgated to do just that. We certainly cannot identify and anticipate every attack. I mean, clearly our adversaries are sophisticated, creative, and to use a physical analogy, you put up a 12-foot fence, they've got a 13-foot ladder, right? They're creative in how they gain access. I do think that industry is doing a very good job, both collaborating, but also working with the technology community, working with academia to find ways to harden their networks, whether it be information or information technology or operational technology networks. We are also taking a page out of the playbook in terms of how we do software security and applying that to the operational environment. When you look at the recent EO for the electricity sector, for example, in terms of both blacklisting, but also whitelisting component parts that are coming out of China primarily, but also other countries, and beginning to acknowledge that there are certain components that if you're a critical infrastructure, a lifeline sector, a national critical function, whatever term that you want to use, that you should not be putting in your systems because of the vulnerability that they pose. And so I think that there are a lot of different initiatives that are underway that are trying to kind of engineer or reverse engineer security into the way that we've built things. But I think there's two important things here. One is that we have to stop re-engineering or building security in and thinking of it as an afterthought. We need to do it at the beginning. And as we go through this, massive modernization of our infrastructure, and not just the traditional infrastructure that Alan alluded to, but as we think to what the connected community and the smart city is going to look like 20 to 30 years from now, and there's, it's being driven by 5G, by electrification. We have to make sure that we are baking in security now. We didn't learn the lesson from the commercialization of the internet. We didn't learn the lessons from the advent of IoT. We have to do it now as we start to build out this infrastructure. I do think also that there's a realization that if there is a successful, coordinated attack that it puts us that is targeted against, whether it be our financial institutions or grid. One of the ideas that has come out of the cyberspace Solarium Commission is the need for a kind of cyber disaster relief fund to mitigate the damage and to quickly get us back on our feet, to demonstrate that that we can withstand the economic consequences of something like that. So that's I think a recommendation from the CSC that deserves merit. But I'll pause there to see if Alan or Seth want to add anything.
Yeah, I might add just one comment. I mean, all great comments, Caitlin, and I agree with all of that. I guess, going back to the question itself, sort of I applaud the thrust of the question in the sense of, it's what I kind of mentioned in my presentation a bit about in all of these things as we think about Homeland Security, the key, the focus is how do we assess and manage risk. And as I say, I mean, there are three components to that. I mean, you can think about, you can attack the threat, which is essentially what you're saying, should we go after every single potential threat? Or can we reduce vulnerabilities through encryption or hardening targets, whatever else, or reduce the consequences of an attack? And in that sense, I think it's an instructive question, because I think it's something that we all in the Homeland Security enterprise and more broadly is, think about all the tools in the toolbox that are available to us to manage risk and reduce that risk. And it could be, to me, I think about after 9/11, we spent, maybe $1 trillion to prevent the next 9/11. And we did a lot of very effective things. But one thing that perhaps might have been the most effective thing we did, which was that we locked the cockpit doors. And that conceivably prevented another type of 9/11 experience. But that was one example of what we could have done to reduce the vulnerability of the airplanes. So I applaud the thrust of the question, because I think it certainly applies in the cyber context, but it also applies in the border context, it applies in the defense against school shootings or whatever else.
Does anyone else have any last words to say? Because we're over time, and unfortunately we have wonderful questions still coming in on satellites, drone strategy, agriculture, climate change, technology. Clearly, you have reached this high-level audience with very, very impressive analysis, and the more you talk, the more they want to hear. But unfortunately, I have to close this event. I know that many busy people couldn't be here, so thank goodness we've recorded it, and it will be available, and you can spread the word as soon as it's up online. So thank you to all. Thank you to Sina, thank you to Insight, and thank you to our wonderful speakers, and go read their book. You'll find it very useful in conceptualizing what we need to be thinking about in going forward. So
Thank you, Dr. Shelley. Thank you.
thank you to all.
And to
Thanks
our
so much.
audience.
Thank you
Bye-bye.
so
Yes,
much.
thank you.